Hello. Continuing with our 80th anniversary of various things, Dunkirk. I'll probably do another one on Dunkirk, the way things are going, but essentially, by now, May 28th, 1940, the evacuation has been proceeding steadily for a couple of days, really. The weekend of the 25th and 26th might well have been one of the most important weekends in recent British history, if not all British history. And certainly, from May 25th, 26th to around about June 1st, 2nd, are John Lukács' 5 Days in London, which he wrote, the name of his book, and he says in it that essentially the fate of the world and Britain certainly was decided in those 5 days. If Britain hadn't decided to fight on and not make peace with Hitler and hadn't gotten the BEF out of France as it did, things might well have been very much different for the future. However, a great deal did happen, as you see in history, and a lot was happening at that weekend to make the British public now realise, if they weren't starting to realise that essentially things weren't as well as they were. At the weekend, in a way, the French and the British have been on the back foot since May 10th when the Germans invaded. They were now in headlong retreat, and certainly the BEF was. What wasn't helping at the same time was that the Belgians were disintegrating on the left, or the right flanks, I suppose it is if you look on it on a map. When they surrendered, I believe it's today, it made things a lot more trickier. If you look at a map, zoom in on it, Dunkirk is only a few miles from the Belgian frontier. Suddenly, Belgium's out of the war, or I say suddenly, everyone's got their head, they're ducking under, they're focusing on the job, and that is to get to and out of Dunkirk, and all of a sudden, the country that's only about, 5-10 miles up the road, is now vanquished, is now defeated. So essentially, the door's been shut on that avenue, and there were still British troops in that part, around Ostend. The weekend is desperate. The Channel ports are besieged, or at least Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk are. There's no hope in hell of the British breaking through to Cherbourg. It'll be suicide in some respects, and they don't have the means to do so in a way. I mean, they've been retreating, and the Germans have just been coming up behind them. Boulogne falls, Calais falls off just as the weekend winds down, really. And Sunday is probably the only time in recent history, maybe ever, that we have a national day of prayer, and the King attended the key service at Westminster Abbey. The only other time I can think of for something like that happening in world history, maybe, is when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone in America was flocking to their local churches, synagogues, whatever, to pray, and they were like, sorry, you see in the film 13 Days, there's placards out front saying pray for peace, or get your confessions in now before you become radioactive dust, kind of thing. The cabinet is still torn, or at least there's factions, like you see in the film Darkest Hour. Halifax wanted to make peace, or at least extend overtures to Hitler via Mussolini, or go out and speak to Roosevelt, who America of course is neutral in the war still, and he would speak to Mussolini, who's not really decided on what he's going to do. In typical Mussolini, he waits until France surrenders, or at least Dunkirk's done with, to declare war on France. Wait for the body to be warm, or to get cold, and that would have been intriguing, I think. The idea of Mussolini, who historically, of course, is not really looked on favourably in any shape or form, but wasn't exactly the brains of Britain, as we would say in this country anyway. He wasn't stupid, but he wasn't entirely clever in World War II. What's he going to do? He's going to get on the train, fly off to Berlin. Adolf, you should really be thinking about making peace with Hitler. Hitler, though, I'd imagine, was in at least 5 minds. He claimed that Britain was not Germany's natural ally. He saw a lot of things similarity. I think Britain, in his mind, was sort of Aryan in its origins. There's a lot of Viking blood, for example, in this country. And certainly Germanic blood as well. And I'm not talking about the royal family from the 18th century. I'm just saying, there is what happened hundreds of years ago. And supposedly, when Britain declared war on September the 3rd, he was shocked. And if somebody's to be believed in I think it's Nazis are warning from history. I think he's meant to be Hitler's valet, so he crops up in all sort of documentaries. Well, he did, he's dead now, unfortunately. Well, he's dead now. Apparently when war was declared about Berchtesgaden, and looking out at the over Salzburg, and the sky was a blood red. The clouds looked like they were filled with blood and stuff, and it was meant to be a portent. But Hitler wanted to, emanate, take after the British Empire. The British Empire was his inspiration, in a career sense of way. He wanted a navy like the Royal Navy, and essentially looked at the British Raj a little as influence. So it's highly debatable. Let's say Halifax gets his way. Would Britain have made peace with Hitler to survive? If we did, it might well have gone like C.J. Sampson writes in his book Dominion, which is where Britain made peace after Dunkirk, and 10 years later, Britain has effectively become a Nazi puppet. The Germans are gradually getting the British Jews out over to the continent. They rule everywhere up to Moscow, and it's grim. The Gestapo are working in London, for instance. However, none of that happened. From us reaching out to Mussolini, to him talking to Hitler. Churchill was up against it in a way. He could have became, people were saying Boris, if he had lost the election in December, could have been our shortest serving Prime Minister. Well, if things had gone against him, Winston Churchill could have been kicked out of office after not even 20 days, really, or at least not even a month. Halifax and others are just must have been. I mean, Churchill, I think, got on with Halifax, but Churchill was seen as sort of like an outcast almost in the Conservative Party, certainly by 1940, because not only was there the horror show of the Dardanelles / Gallipoli, there was various actions in India, probably the Middle East he had something to do with at some point on, and even in this war, Norfolk. I mean, it goes almost unnoticed, but the British were still in Norway when Dunkirk was happening, albeit they took Norfolk on the 26th, and then next the order to evacuate came. Again, if that by itself was happening, it would have been a bit of a disaster, but the force in Norway was insignificant to what we had coming through France to Dunkirk. So on the 28th, Churchill gets a gathering of the outer cabinet, like you see in Darkest Hour, of course. In the film they make out, he's talking to the British public on the underground. Churchill only ever used the underground once and got lost. To be fair, in his day, people were still smoking on the underground, so there was probably a lot of smoke and stuff that was getting in his way, never mind his smoke. It's a nice scene. It's poetic license at its most extreme. For a start, he's going from St James's Park to Westminster. And I don't want to be nitpicky or nerdy, but essentially, I've done that journey many, many, many times, be it all the way from Wimbledon out east and vice versa, or indeed, as I did once because I was lazy, Westminster to St James's Park, and it's not even a minute-long journey. But anyway, in reality, Churchill, he gathers the outer cabinet before he meets with the war cabinet. And today's the day it all blew up, in the sense that Churchill got his way. In a way, it's a stroke of absolute genius, because he got the outer cabinet. And essentially, as you saw from the Darkest Hour, he's going, do you want Hitler to be marching up Whitehall? Do you want him to be subjugating this island? Do you want him to be setting up his horror shows over here? And all this stuff. And the cabinet, they're getting G'd along with it, like the public would have done if they had heard it on the radio. And then he says, let's keep going until the victory, or we're all lying drowning in each other's blood. fantastic Churchillian rhetoric, really. Churchill had a way with words that no one else did. And today I'd imagine he would have said something about coronavirus, grab it by the scruff of our neck and throttle it until we are no longer sneezing and coughing or something, I don't know. But that our cabinet not only saved him, but saved Britain in a minor sort of way. Because, Churchill, he's got the support of the cabinet, the our cabinet, and then he goes into Parliament, and it goes his way, effectively. And people forget that actually the famous speeches Churchill made was in Parliament. I mean, even my nan said that, I heard his speeches on the radio. Now, alright, he did do radio speeches, but the famous one, like, we'll never surrender, was in Parliament. He recorded them, and then they were played on radio and stuff, and indeed he was probably a bit more dramatic, but, could you imagine what it would have been like to, say you sat in the People's Gallery, or the Strangers Gallery, whatever they call it, and Parliament is filled with people, and some of them are probably wearing uniforms by now, and indeed a couple of days ago, a chap called Richard Porritt became the first member of Parliament killed in World War II, falling outside a place called Secklin, near Lille. He was only 29, and then on the 30th of May, another member of Parliament was killed. So some of them will be wearing uniform, I'd imagine, you never know. And the Conservative Party is presumably still very much hostile to Churchill, or lukewarm, and Labour, Labour seemed to be, at one point, the only ones backing Chamberlain in the Norway debate. I mean, it's politics, it's weird, isn't it? And Churchill stands up and then at some point. And the thing is, I know that speech well, but now that I'm facing an audience, we'll fight them on the beaches, and we'll fight them on the landing grounds, we'll fight them in the hills and in the streets. We'll fight them with growing confidence in the air. Dun dun dun. We will never surrender. Can you imagine watching that as he says it for the first time in history? And presumably it's a little bit warm like it is now. Not as warm as it is today. Today's insane. And you hear that man speak, and to you, he is just another Prime Minister. He is not the great man of history yet. I think that would be I would have had a chill down my bloody spine, to be honest. Whatever I thought of the man. And Parliament backed him. And then after Dunkirk, which I may touch upon when it happens, Britain had to do things to show the world, if anything, we were prepared. Britain was prepared to do things to survive, but also we had to do hard things. And that is to say, when the Royal Navy shelled the French fleet at Oman. Still suffering, that is a sore wound in Anglo-French relations. And it was not something the Royal Navy were happy about doing. It was not something that the Royal Navy went, we've just sunk some ships, like when we sunk the Bismarck maybe, or the Sword of Grass Bay scuttled. Because France was still seen as an ally. But it was necessary. Those ships, if Hitler had got his hands on, could have, if he had used them properly, because as you saw with the Bismarck episode, he wasn't exactly a great strategist, even on water. Those ships could well have tipped his favour in 1940. Imagine German, German-flagged French battleships and cruisers. It wouldn't have won in the war immediately, but you never know. The Battle of Atlantic could have been swayed early on in his favour until Britain and then America got going. It's a big reach, but this is what's going through Churchill's mind. Anyway, we'll get to that when we do. So by now, May 28th, about 15,000 men have been lifted from the port of Dunkirk, about 7,800 by the end of Sunday and about 8,000 on the Monday. So Tuesday the 28th of May it carries on, and Dunkirk carried on really until about June 2nd. There was some afterwards. Words can never convey the absolute horror show that Dunkirk must have been from about May 24th, 25th. Lord Gort is effectively a week before said, well, that's it, let's try and get back to Dunkirk. The French are doing their own thing. I'm not really optimistic we're going to get out of this okay. So we'll start retreating back to Dunkirk. Some bright spark in the Navy, and no one knows who it is exactly. Somebody low down in Whitehall on May 14th had sent out drafted a message that was put out on the BBC for small boat owners to register their boats for future use. Well, if they hadn't done that, Dunkirk might not have happened as it did, because those little boats started turning up in Ramsgate and Sheerness over the weekend. And the boat owners, were like, well, hang on, we're the only ones that know our craft, and not leaving it to some chap from the Navy. And some of the craft used, my God, I mean, the English Channel, the Germans have called it a ditch. Some ditch, when you're pushing over a boat that is better suited for the Thames round Twickenham or something. Because essentially, you've got 300,000 men in Dunkirk, but most of them are on the beaches, and you can only take so many from the port because of how big the port is. Now, it's a reasonably big port, Dunkirk, but it's bloody small when you've got the Luftwaffe constantly bombing you in long-range artillery landing, perhaps. Dunkirk never really suffered from what Calais did at the end, or Boulogne, and that is small arms fire. A couple captains were killed on their destroyer bridges in Boulogne by sniper fire. So you got that go. You've got the roads into Dunkirk are choked. The Germans are now more or less up on either side. They thought it's like a weird flat shape, and the canal is more or less the perimeter. And you've got the rear guard, and then you got its stages. Really, Dunkirk was this sort of huge model village place. It was just like it had been, placed under a dome or some such. And it was clear. I really thought it was clear earlier on that essentially some of these men are not going to be able to escape. For the evacuation to work, the rear guard would have to hold on as long as they bloody well could and not retreat. If they were, I suppose it would have to be a sudden action with the German tanks coming out. So the tanks are coming, the Luftwaffe are pounding away, and people say there's still a myth that the RAF didn't really do anything. Well, they did. They did their damnedest, really. During the evacuation, the RAF were in the mix with Fighter Command. Now, most of the action happened away from Dunkirk, because, in the air, battles, are not static in place. So, Hurricanes and Spitfires are engaging the enemy, and the Defiance, which, despite the fact there's a new book coming out saying how great they were, still have a legend of being quite useless, unfortunately, being cannon fodder. If the Stuka was our cannon fodder, the Defiant was theirs. And yet, apparently, they actually scored more kills than Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons during Dunkirk. And that's the thing, where some of the men that went on into the Battle of Britain became aces over Dunkirk. And they did their best. Quite a few died. I think a couple of dozen pilots were lost over Dunkirk. And it wasn't just Fighter Command, Bomber Command, who are yet to perfect their skills that they did from 42 onwards. They're getting involved, trying to harass the enemy. So the action is above and beyond, and the Navy is still in the thick of it, and some of these ships were at Boulogne and Calais. You can only imagine the stress that the ships themselves have been put through, shelled and bombed and shot at, and now they're having to go back and forth over the channel. The more modern destroyers are pulled out by Ramsay. He's got one eye on invasion, and it's all building apace. By the end of Dunkirk, it has become the greatest evacuation of men in human history. 40,000, 50,000 was the conservative estimate, and even then over, say, 3, maybe 4 days. But in the space of 5, 6, 7 days, 338,226 men were lifted from the beaches and port. Incredible, and it saved this nation and possibly the world. The trouble is, though, Dunkirk was a defeat. Even Churchill was like, wars are not won by evacuations. It gave Britain breathing space, though. I mean, one of the images I can't get, there's various things that sometimes my head can't get around, and it's the sight of all those men sat on the beaches. This is the creme de la creme of the British Army. This is the core of the British Army, and they're all stood and sat on beaches like it's flipping Margate in the summer. They're doing nothing. They've got nothing to do except try and get off the beaches. Most of them haven't got their weapons with them. They've long left their units. Well, there's no cohesion as a thing. I don't think there was anywhere on the beaches anyway where you could say, well, that was the Ox and Bucks, and that was the Norfolks, and that was the Sherwood Foresters. There wasn't they mostly kept together, but if you looked on a map, or a war map, I don't think there's anywhere that sort of says, well, look, the Norfolks were stood over here by this bit, and whatever. And it's the what ifs now. They say that Hitler could have, if he hadn't halted on the 24th and 26th, he could have gone onto the beaches. And that's the thing. Presumably, when they rolled up Dunkirk, the tanks would have been on the beaches. And it's the image of tanks racing onto the sand into the crowds of men. Would they have fired on them? Some of them probably would have from the SS, in particular at the time. And the sight of all these hundreds of thousands of men sticking their hands up, and there would have possibly still been the little boats at sea. And but as I say, it didn't happen, thank God. So that is for now another video. Dunkirk, and probably do another one on Dunkirk at some time, and then Oman, start the Battle of Britain in July, and surrender of France, and then Oman, and see if we can get to September and the Battle of Britain.